If you liked this video, please click on the subscribe button and then click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video.
Every year, and this is no different, every year, I, along with millions of other ministers in various denominations in the pulpit, have to do this Thanksgiving sermon. It's kind of the law. You can't break the law. It's Thanksgiving. You have to do a Thanksgiving sermon. And every year, I don't know how other ministers do this, but I struggle with what to say because there's only so much you can say about giving thanks and about being thankful together for things. And there's only so much you can say about the history of Thanksgiving that people already know. Hard to introduce things that they don't know. So what I'm going to say today is probably not surprising to most of you. It's not something you probably are unfamiliar with. I think most of you here at least have some knowledge about the history of Thanksgiving and about that first so-called Thanksgiving. Because second only to the discovery of America by Columbus, the Thanksgiving myth is the one that we grew up with and which our children are still taught in school. It's our quintessential American origin story, right? It's the story that we tell ourselves and we've told each other since the beginning of the nation. And you all know it well. The white English settlers that we call pilgrims had landed in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and they established a small colony that struggled to survive through the winter. And they were helped by the native people of the Wampanoag tribe who provided food, and they helped build shelter for them. And then they taught them how to plant grain and corn. And according to the story, the pilgrims were so thankful that when the winter was over and harvest time finally came again, they had a great feast of Thanksgiving and they invited the Indians to join them. I used to grow up thinking that they sent some of the pilgrims over to the Indian village and told them, come on over, we're having dinner and you're invited. And they served turkey and pie and corn and all the other fixings that we think of at Thanksgiving time. And then they all lived happily ever after. And by now, I suspect that most, if not all of you here, know that that's just a bunch of hooey. It's a bunch of nonsense. It didn't happen that way. And that myth of Thanksgiving has been built up over time, but it originates in the eyewitness of one of the Pilgrim Fathers, Edward Winslow was his name. And he lists the crops in his journal, the crops that did well and the crops that failed, and the gathering of crops at the harvest time he talks about. And it comes, that harvest time comes when the last sheaf of wheat and the last ear of corn has been harvested, and that's called harvest home. Traditionally in England, it was called harvest home, and that's what the Pilgrims were really celebrating. It really wasn't so much a Thanksgiving as we think of it now. And it's true that they did give thanks, but when did they not give thanks? These were the Pilgrims. They were always praying. They were always giving thanks or always asking for help from their God. And, the journal cites a number of instances in the previous year when that group also gave thanks. So it wasn't the first Thanksgiving dinner. And he writes this, he says, our harvest being got in, our governor sent 4 men out fowling, meaning to hunt for geese and ducks and things, so that we might after a special manner rejoice together after we had gathered the fruits of our labors. And so whatever fowl that they killed, it's probably not turkey because their weapons were much better suited for shooting ducks and geese on the water rather than birds in flight or running away from them. And also because after years and years of excavation at the Plymouth site where the village was, only one turkey bone has been found, ever. So they didn't eat turkey, at least not right away. Now, the Native Americans there, they taught the settlers about pumpkins, and they ate pumpkin with them and squash and everything. But they didn't have any pies because they had no butter and they had no flour. And they didn't have ovens for baking yet. And what they did is they sliced and they fried their pumpkin. And sweet potatoes weren't known yet. Those were from the South. They had, and pecan pie was eaten much later on. So all of those things we think of as quintessentially Thanksgiving, and as part of that first Thanksgiving dinner, weren't there. But the centerpiece of that celebrating harvest home was made up of 5 deer that were brought by the Wampanoag tribe. The deer was prepared in a stew with corn and maize and beans and other meat. And one person who wrote in their journal, it doesn't say who it was, says, they, meaning the Indians, boil in this fermenty all sorts of flesh that they had taken in hunting, such as venison, and this is really yummy now, venison, beaver, bear, moose, otter, raccoon, and all sorts of artichokes and nuts and squashes. There wasn't any cranberry sauce, so. But aside from that bucolic description, there's a deeper truth that our Thanksgiving holiday has roots in colonization and in violence and white Christian supremacy and racism. What we tell ourselves is a feel-good narrative that tries to rationalize and justify the white man's conquest and the decimation of the indigenous population and the destruction of a land that was never theirs and, to be honest, still isn't. Contrary to the popular version of the myth, the Pilgrims didn't arrive to an unsettled wilderness. For many years before, the land had been well managed by the Wampanoag and the other tribes in the area. Land had been cleared for cornfields and other crops like beans and squash, as well as for game. And the Wampanoags, like most Indians on the East Coast, were not nomads. They were farmers. They didn't travel around. They just stayed where they were and farmed. And it was a large and powerful nation. Estimates of the tribe back then, which was in southeastern Massachusetts and eastern Rhode Island, the estimates that there were almost 100,000 members of the Wampanoag Nation. And they lived in 69 different colonies. But between 1616 and 1619, the Plymouth colony experienced an epidemic. We might say a pandemic, since that was the known world. An epidemic that they passed on to the Wampanoag tribe, and it decimated the Wampanoag tribe greatly. There were so many that died, we don't know how many died. That had the effect also of destabilizing the relations that the Wampanoags had with the other neighboring tribes, who were really traditional enemies. And I want to say something here. I don't know if you've ever met people who say, well, before the white man came here, the Indian tribes, they were killing each other off too. We killed Indians, but they were killing each other off too. They were, savages at war with each other. And my answer to that is, yes, they were. They were at war with each other, just like the white people were at war amongst themselves in Europe. Just like white people are still at war amongst themselves today. So that doesn't fly. Well, we civilized them. They were at war killing each other. It's silly. But this this epidemic that they went through destabilized these relations with their traditional enemies, the Narragansett, the Mohegan, and the Pequot Indians. And by the time 1620 came around, the Wampanoag were at full-scale war with the Narragansett. And the Pilgrims used that to their advantage. They played off of each other, of those tribes. And at one time they were in alliance with the Narragansett and another time with the Wampanoag, whichever suited them best. The harvest celebration that they held with the Wampanoag wasn't as much of a neighborly dinner. We should probably think of it more like an uneasy state dinner. The only reason the Indians were invited isn't because these white settlers went over and invited them. The white settlers had gone out into the woods to hunt, and the Wampanoag heard the sound of their muskets. And about 50 or so of them came running to see what was happening. And the white men said, well, you're here now, you may as well stay. And they didn't have a lot of food. And that's when the Wampanoag men went out and brought back these 5 deer for the feast. But knowing even just that about the actual history of that harvest festival we call Thanksgiving might cause some people to say, okay, but we can still have a Thanksgiving celebration, right? You know, and I need to be clear, I have no problem with being thankful or even having a day set aside to be thankful. I mean, I love cooking. I love cooking a turkey and all the trimmings. And I love pie, Arlene's pies especially. My favorite is pumpkin. That's a hint, Arlene. My favorite is pumpkin pie. And I may even sit with Lisa and watch a football game if the Green Bay Packers are playing. We have our traditions in our family too for Thanksgiving. It's the day that we watch the Macy's Day Parade. This year they will be having the parade, but all of the songs and everything will be online. They won't be live. Then we watch the National Dog Show. And then later on, we sit and we watch A Christmas Carol with Alastair Sim, of course, for the first time for the holiday season. And we also watch A Muppet Christmas Carol. Just a nice day to be with family and be thankful that we're all together, especially this year. But I think it's important, though, that we disabuse ourselves and others of the notion that our traditional national Thanksgiving holiday means the same thing to our Native sisters and brothers. Maybe you recall the words that Frederick Douglass said when he gave a speech on the 4th of July in 1852 in Rochester, New York, to a primarily white audience. He said this, and this was the 4th of July, Frederick Douglass. He said, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Your sermons and thanksgivings with all your religious parade and solemnity are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages." Now that was Frederick Douglass in 1852 on the 4th of July. But imagine if a Native person, a Native American, had given that same speech on Thanksgiving. It would sound pretty much the same. What to our Native sisters and brothers is our Thanksgiving? For many American and Alaskan indigenous people, Thanksgiving is a day of mourning and protest, since it commemorates the arrival of settlers in North America and centuries of oppression and genocide that followed later. For the last 51 years, the United American Indians of New England have organized a rally and a day of mourning on Thanksgiving. And here's what they have to say about this choice to mourn. Thanksgiving Day, they say, is a reminder of the genocide of millions of Native people, the theft of Native lands, and the relentless assault on Native culture. Participants in National Day of Mourning honor Native ancestors and the struggle of Native peoples to survive today. It's a day of remembrance and spiritual connection, as well as a protest of the racism and oppression which Native Americans continue to experience. There's no need to remind you of the way Native people have been treated over the years. We all know it. We know about the Trail of Tears. We know about forcing Native Americans onto reservations. We know about children torn from families and sent to Christian schools where they would be prohibited from speaking their own language or wearing their own clothes or their hairstyles, where they'd be forced to give up their culture and their own spiritual beliefs. We know about the mass slaughter of the buffalo, a deliberate slaughter of the buffalo as a way of forcing Native people into near starvation. You know, one time there were so many buffalo in the United States that their herds covered entire states. That's how many buffalo there were. But it's important to also remember that this mistreatment continues today. And it becomes especially apparent this year during the COVID epidemic, the pandemic. Even as Native peoples continue to fight for their land like they did at Standing Rock and other places, and they continue to do, and for adequate health care on the reservations, this mistreatment still continues. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, released a new study back in August. And it specifically examines how COVID-19 is affecting American Indians and Alaskan Natives. That's one of the racial and minority groups at highest risk from the disease. The CDC found that in 23 selected states, the cumulative incidence of laboratory confirmed COVID-19 cases among American Indians and Alaskan Natives was 3.5 times higher than that of non-Hispanic whites. 3.5 times higher. The data also showed that those who tested positive for SARS-CoV-2, which is a different form of the COVID, tended to be younger than white non-Hispanic individuals with COVID-19. A higher percentage of cases among Native Indians and Alaskan Natives were people under 18 years of age. And a smaller percentage of cases were 65 years or older. Recent CDC studies have shown that American Indians and Alaskan Natives are among the racial and ethnic minority groups at higher risk for severe COVID-19 outcomes. That means they could die. They're higher risk of dying. And persisting racial inequity and historical trauma, I like the way they say that, historical trauma, have contributed to disparities in health and socioeconomic factors between the American Indian and Alaskan Native and white populations. This elevated incidence, the report says, within this population might also reflect differences in reliance on shared transportation, limited access to running water, household size, and other factors that might facilitate community transmission. It all ties together, the way we've treated our Native population in the past, and this pandemic and how it's affecting them. If you know anything about living on a reservation, you know that a lot of reservations have problems getting running water. They have to have water trucked in, or they have to go with their cars and get it in jugs and bring it home, which means they have to ride close together in cars. Their families are often living in overcrowded conditions. And so all of that compounds the seriousness of this pandemic on the Native population. And this is the kind of thing that white America forgets. We're infected with this collective national amnesia about our past and the continuing legacy of social and racial injustice that our nation is founded on. Instead, we tell ourselves comforting stories like the Thanksgiving story, but we do that to our shame. And until we begin as a nation to face the truth and address and correct things, I don't think we can truly celebrate a day of Thanksgiving in any meaningful national manner. But we can do it individually and as families and communities of faith like ours. We can take time to remember the past, to commit ourselves to work for change. We cannot undo what our white ancestors did, but we can work to change the legacy that they left, the unfortunate legacy. And we can raise awareness about the plight of indigenous people and everyone who is oppressed. You might ask, do any Native Americans celebrate Thanksgiving? And one Native American website that I visited writes this. It says, while some Native Americans have chosen to reject the Thanksgiving holiday entirely, many embrace the positive messages of the holiday and choose to put aside thoughts about the complex history of this day. This is because, it says, the idea of giving thanks is central to a Native heritage and culture. And in this way, Thanksgiving is simply a chance to appreciate the good things of life, like family, community, and the riches of the land. Long before settlers arrived, Native tribes were celebrating the autumn harvest and the gift of Mother Earth's abundance. Native American spirituality, both traditionally and today, emphasizes gratitude for creation, care for the environment, and recognition of the human need for communion with nature and others. Thanksgiving as a holiday originates, it says, from the Native American philosophy of giving without expecting anything in return. That's how we can recognize Thanksgiving and celebrate Thanksgiving, I think, in a more complete and a truer way, a more spiritual way, if you will, this year. And so may that original spirit of Thanksgiving, celebrated by our Native sisters and brothers, be the reason that we celebrate Thanksgiving this year. May it be so.